Again, Hub's History Online. Topic number 4. We have been focusing on nationalism and the rise of nationalism in all these places, starting with Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, moving on to Gandhi in India, and last time looking at some good and some bad nationalists such as Ho Chi Minh from Vietnam, Pol Pot from Cambodia, and Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar. But when you look at these 5 names that we covered, again, they're good and they're bad. As we enter into a new region, Africa, you're going to run into some real positive figures. Some men that overcame tremendous odds trying to liberate their country from European control. But before we get to their rise, let's look at how this all began. We know that Africa was torn apart in the 1800s. We also know that at the Berlin Conference of 1884, that Germany held a meeting to divide Africa relatively evenly between itself and 7 other nations. So the 8 European nations that divided Africa were Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So these 8 nations all divided parts of Africa and drained it of its resources. That's really important you guys remember that these areas in Africa were colonial possessions, meaning they existed primarily to fund and aid and supply the mother country with tons of resources. And of course, once they received those resources, the European countries would produce new goods, and then those colonies became the purchasers, meaning they were the new markets for the European powers. Now, Africa absolutely needed Europe. Unfortunately, this is very similar to the way the Spanish interacted with the natives. Because these African nations were so dependent on Europe, they did not know how to function without them. And that's going to play a role in the future of the African continent. Now, there was some resistance movements. We did have people resist in Belgium, and they got their hands cut off and they got tortured and murdered. We did have the Zulu resist in South Africa, and they lost as well. Now we do know that Liberia and Ethiopia were successful in fending off European control. But what we also know is that unfortunately, as time went on, fighting against the Europeans became impossible. So they began to look to other means and methods, such as the one similar to what Gandhi did in India. They protested, formed unions, boycotted European goods. They began to use nonviolence in a way to bring about a new level of resistance. Unfortunately, while some protests were nonviolent, others were extremely violent. It gets to the point where sometimes you don't know what to expect, and when people aren't changing with nonviolence, your anger forces you to use violence, and that violence can lead to the death of thousands. But when you really look at it, Europe doesn't really care, because it's not like the Africans are coming to Europe. The Africans are killing people in their own country, so it's not really having a major effect on Europe as a whole. So what starts to happen was a widespread nationalistic movement pushing for the unification of all Africans against Europeans. This became known as Pan-Africanism, and it will spread around the world. There are going to be famed Americans like Marcus Garvey, who really do push for widespread Pan-Africanism, but the movement just couldn't take off because of all the different tribal regions, but really because they were controlled by so many other European nations. Now, fast forward 80 years. We're now in the 1950s and early 1960s. Once the dust settled from World War II, a lot of European nations felt that it was time to release their nations or their colonies into independence. The problem is, a lot of these countries didn't know what to do. So Europe kind of stuck around and aided them a lot, helped them develop new governments, helped them develop an economy. But for the most part, Africa is still going to be decades, if not centuries behind the European technology, the European advancements, the European achievements, the European period. So we are going to see the rise of certain men who kind of take hold of not only their nation, but they kind of set the bar for nationalism in their world. So we're going to start with Egypt. Now, Egypt was given its independence by the British after World War I. But like I said, just because they were given their independence doesn't mean they knew what to do with it. So Britain stuck around to help them. They stuck around so much that, of course, all of the government's secret missions and all the government's secret aids and all the government's relations and connections were instituted by the British. That means the economy was controlled by the British, production was controlled by the British, and all the money ended up going to Britain. In walks this man in the early 1950s, Gamal Nasser, who threw out the Egyptian puppet king, who was controlled by the British, and created a free republic. One of the first things he does is he nationalizes all the industries in Egypt. What that means is that he took them away from the European powers and gave them back to the Egyptian people. They now owned the production. They now owned the factories. They now owned the economy. They were technically free. Now, don't get me wrong. The Europeans were really upset. Britain tried to invade Egypt, but they were weakened so badly by World War II that a successful attempt to remove Nasser failed. One of the things that Nasser really prided himself was taking back the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was something that was built by the British, and basically what it did was it shortened the trade route by allowing them to take the canal to the Red Sea, and what that does is it cuts around to the Indian Ocean and allows them to get to Asia faster. The British took all the profits and all the money and all the taxes, but now the Suez Canal belonged to Egypt, and it still does to this day. Gamal Nasser was seen as a nationalist hero and is still looked upon as one of the greatest Egyptian leaders in their history. Nasser was not the only nationalist of his time. In the 1950s and 60s, you're going to see widespread independence movements. Now, we're not going to be able to talk about every African nation, that's for sure. But let's look at this man here, Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah is a nationalist who believed that Ghana needed to be a democracy and have freedom and have independence and have an identity. And he was successful in establishing that in his country, Ghana. At the same time, we have Jomo Kenyatta, who did the same exact thing, brought a democratic republic to the nation of Kenya. These two men are always compared for these two facts. They both removed the British, but at the same time, they adopted British government because it worked. The difference between the two now, between British rule and the new British government, is that the Africans were the technical people in charge now. The British government was no longer there. It was a British-style government, parliament, leadership, democracy, but run by the African people. And that's really, really important. And that's why these two men, Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, are nationalist heroes in their countries. But probably the most famous African nationalist, probably ever, fought a fight in South Africa that took decades to resolve. The whites controlled South Africa. They had controlled the South African region for centuries. This goes all the way back to the 1600s when the Dutch Boers basically overthrew the native groups, rolled in, stole the land, and took over production. But in the 1880s, you have what became known as the Zulu resistance. The Zulu openly fought against the Boers and lost. But once the Boers beat the Zulu, they had an incoming invasion from the British. When the British fought the Boers, the British destroyed them. The British took over South Africa and gave it its independence in 1902. Since then, whites had controlled the government, even though they were the minority. But one of the things that they really wanted to do was show their dominance and show their control. So in 1948, the South African white minority government created a policy known as apartheid. Apartheid is literally segregation. Whites and blacks, even though they lived in the same area, they had to exist in two separate worlds. This draws a lot of comparison, of course, to segregation in the South in the United States in the 18 and early 1900s. Apartheid is an example of a human rights violation. By denying people their basic rights and freedom, you are subjecting them to unfair rules and unfair laws based on their race. And unfortunately, South Africa was really good at separating. This is a sign that you guys can see a beach, white area, and basically what that meant is that the blacks would be arrested if they set foot on that sand. Now in 1952, they forced the blacks to carry passbooks just to show where they belonged. But it was another way to just control the people who lived in South Africa. Here are just some images to show you guys. If you notice in the corner here, it says the Apartheid Museum. You can actually find images online that show this. Non-whites only, whites only. And you notice that it also has the native language as well on the bottom. But this just goes to show you that unfortunately, segregation or apartheid was an enormous problem. Beach and sea for whites only. And one of the things, I don't have the picture here, but the whites were given the most beautiful beaches you've ever seen. The sand was so clear, there were no rocks, and most people would never bump into another soul. But the black beaches, the ones the blacks were supposed to use, were rocky, dangerous, and unsafe. But this is again a way for the white minority to control the Africans who live there. Now if you look here, it says blacks, coloreds, and Asians. Try to understand. At this time in history, Hindus made up an enormous population in South Africa. So unfortunately, they were rolled into this hatred. Basically, that's why it says whites and non-whites. All right. You can see here under Section 37 of Dubron Beach Bylaws, this bathing area is reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. They really did stick their, I guess they really stuck their power wherever they could. And they used their skin color, their ethnicity, their race to hold down the Africans who lived there. Here is a random police officer stopping a black man looking at his card. That was quite common. You'll see a lot of that in Nazi Germany as well during the Holocaust. Here is blacks and non-blacks. Again, I could show you pictures like this forever. The hatred that existed in this world is quite frightening. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. But in comes this man, nationalist leader Nelson Mandela, who joined the African National Congress and eventually became its leader. Their sole purpose was to abolish apartheid and bring about equality in South Africa. Unfortunately, one of the things that he really wanted, equality, was never going to happen. The white minority really kept their hands on control of power and really did not share any of the authority, any of the freedoms, and any of the rights. So he wrote a document known as the Freedom Charter. This document basically demanded rights and liberties for all South African blacks. Unfortunately, even though the document was powerful, it did not give them the rights they desired. Because of his involvement in numerous protests, and some were even violent, Mandela was put on trial and found guilty of crimes. Violent crimes. Even though he was there, he wasn't really responsible, but this was a way for the white minority to shut him up. From 1962 until his release in 1991, Nelson Mandela was locked away in a South African prison. But what's amazing is that his voice was still widely heard. He fought even behind bars to end apartheid and bring about racial unity, racial connection, racial equality. And in 1990, when he is released from prison, he fought with the Prime Minister, his last name was de Klerk, to focus on an end of apartheid. In 1994, Mandela ran for and was elected the first freely chosen black president in South Africa. Although he did pass away about 4 or 5 years ago, Mandela's impact as one of the greatest nationalists in world history is still felt. His ideas, his message, his words still ring true all over the world. Nasser, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Mandela. Four nationalists that redefined the African continent. Four nationalists who draw a lot of comparison to other major leaders in world history. Africa is going to struggle tremendously in the years following their independence, but at least they were finally free to make their own choices. That sums up African nationalism in the mid to late 1900s. I hope you guys had it. I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you guys understand it. As always, reach out if you have any questions. I'm here if you need me. Catch you next time on Hub's History Online.